A statue's face seemed to smile, and a dying 10-year-old girl rose from her bed, healed. A 14-year-old girl clung to the knees of a pope. His guards had to carry her out of the room. She promised the world a shower of roses from heaven. People are still reporting them today. Her name was Thérèse Martin, a cloistered nun in a small convent in Normandy, France, who left its walls only once as an adult and never again. The pope she begged was Leo XIII. The infant baptized on the day she died would grow up to become Pope Paul VI, the man who would close the Second Vatican Council. She became one of only 4 women in 2,000 years of church history to be named a doctor of the church, a teacher of the faith, ranked beside Augustine and Aquinas. And yet, in her final 18 months, dying slowly of a wasting illness in a convent infirmary, she wrote something her own sisters tried for decades to keep hidden. She was no longer certain heaven was there at all. She had promised to spend her heaven doing good on earth. She died without the comfort of knowing there was a heaven to spend. So what really happened inside those convent walls? In the darkest months of a saint the world remembers as sweet. This is Halos and Histories, stories the saints left behind. Alençon, France, January 2nd, 1873. In a narrow house on the Rue Saint-Blaise, a lace-maker named Zélie Guérin gave birth to her 9th child. She was baptized 2 days later, Marie-Françoise Therese. Her family would simply call her Therese. Zélie had already buried 4 of her children in infancy. She had wanted, once, to give her life to God in a convent. A prioress had turned her away. So she had married a watchmaker named Louis Martin instead, and together they had built something they called, without irony, a school for saints. 9 children raised on early mass, quiet obedience, and long winter evenings spent reading aloud by the fire. Of Zélie's letters that survive, dozens are about her youngest daughter. She worried about Therese's health. She worried about her temper. The girl could fall into tears at the smallest correction, then apologize for crying about crying. Therese would later remember only smiles and tender caresses from those first years, though her mother remembered something more complicated. A bright, difficult child, easily wounded, fiercely loved. On August 28, 1877, Zélie Martin died after a long illness. Therese was 4 years old. The household did not fall apart. It reorganized around the wound. Marie, the eldest daughter, only 13 herself, took over running the house. Pauline, the second daughter, and the one Therese would later call her second mother, took over Therese's religious instruction. Louis Martin closed his watchmaking business, gathered his 5 surviving daughters, and moved the family to Lisieux, a town in Normandy where his late wife's brother and his family already lived. There, in a house called Les Buissonnets, something in Therese changed. She had been an affectionate, unremarkable child before her mother's death. Afterward, by her own account, she became timid, oversensitive, prone to weeping at the slightest provocation. A girl who needed constant reassurance that she had been good that day, that God was pleased with her, that the angels were watching. Every night, Pauline would send her to fetch something from a dark, distant room, alone. Therese hated it. Pauline made her do it anyway. Years later, Therese would understand this as a kind of mercy, a sister quietly teaching a frightened child not to be afraid of the dark. Louis Martin doted on his youngest daughter without spoiling her. In the evenings, she took her place beside him at prayer, watching how he knelt, how he prayed, memorizing, without knowing she was memorizing it, what devotion was supposed to look like on a grown man's face. She would say later that she only had to look at her father to understand how the saints prayed. But the house at Les Buissonnets held two griefs that year, not one. Therese had lost her mother, and one by one, she began to watch her older sisters, the women who had raised her, mothered her, replaced what she had lost, start to leave. Pauline was the first to go. In 1882, she entered the Carmelite convent in Lisieux, a cloistered order whose nuns rarely saw their own families again. Therese was 9 years old. She did not understand yet what a convent was, or what cloistered meant. She only understood that the person who had raised her since her mother died was walking behind a set of doors that closed and would not open again. She would spend the next 6 years trying to follow her through them. By the winter of 1883, Therese was 10 years old, and something in her had begun to break down. It started as headaches, then came trembling, fear without a cause. Nights she could not sleep, and days she could barely stand. The doctors who examined her had no name for it that satisfied anyone. Some in the family feared she would not live. Others feared something worse, that whatever was happening to her would never end. Her uncle's family took her in to nurse her. Her sister Marie, alarmed, wrote letters trying every remedy she could think of. Nothing worked. The girl who had once been merely sensitive was now, by her own later account, barely recognizable to herself. Gripped by terrors she could not explain and could not stop. On May 13th, 1883, her sisters gathered in the room where Therese lay, kneeling before a small statue of the Virgin Mary that had been placed near her bed. They prayed to Our Lady of Victories. Therese, watching from her pillow, turned her eyes toward the statue's face. She would later write of what happened next in 4 short sentences that her own family had not expected, and that she herself struggled to explain. Our Blessed Lady has come to me. She has smiled upon me. How happy I am. The statue's carved, painted face, Therese insisted, had seemed to move, to soften, to smile at her directly, the way a mother smiles at a child. And in that moment, whatever had been consuming her for months simply stopped. She sat up. She was, by every account of everyone present, entirely well. It should have ended there, a private grace, witnessed by her own sisters, kept inside the family. Instead, her sister Marie asked Therese to describe what had happened to the other nuns at the convent where Pauline now lived. Therese obeyed. She told them about the smile. What followed surprised her more than the illness had. The nuns pressed her with questions. How exactly had the statue moved? What exactly had she seen? Was she certain? Was she sure? Therese, only 10, found she could not answer with the same simple confidence she had felt in the room. Doubt crept in where there had been none. She would later confess that she began to wonder if she had imagined the whole thing, or worse, exaggerated it into something it was not. I thought I had lied, she wrote years afterward. I was unable to look upon myself without a feeling of profound horror. For a child who wanted, more than anything, to be good, to be believed, to be trusted, to never disappoint the people she loved, this was its own private suffering, quieter than the illness, but longer lived. The self-doubt would follow her, on and off, for years. Vatican records would later treat the cure itself as an established fact of her early life, cited without qualification in the Church's own official biography of her. But what the Church remembers as a healing, Therese herself remembered as two events tangled together. A moment of light, followed by a long, private struggle to trust that the light had been real. It was an early rehearsal, though no one could have known it then, for something far larger still to come. A battle not over what she had seen, but over what she could still believe. By 14, Therese had made a decision that unsettled everyone around her. She wanted to enter Carmel. Not someday, not at the normal age, but now, immediately, alongside the sister she had lost to it 5 years earlier. The obstacles arrived one after another. The Mother Superior of the convent refused her outright. She was too young, and the Carmelite rule did not admit girls of 14. The parish priest who normally handled such requests told her to come back when she was 21. Undeterred, Therese went over his head to the Bishop of Bayeux and Lisieux himself. Before the meeting, she pinned up her hair, hoping it would make her look older. The bishop found the gesture charming and, for years afterward, could not tell the story of Therese without mentioning it. He was charmed. He was not, however, ready to say yes. He told her and her father he would need time to consider it and would write with his decision. Therese had already planned what she would do if Bayeux failed her. She would go over the bishop's head, too. That November, Louis Martin took Therese and her sister Céline on a diocesan pilgrimage to Rome. An unrelated trip, arranged for entirely different reasons, that Therese had quietly decided to use for her own purpose. On November 20th, 1887, the pilgrims were granted a general audience with Pope Leo XIII. Word went around beforehand. No one was to speak to the Holy Father directly. It would prolong the audience too long. Therese turned to Céline. "Speak," her sister told her. When her turn came to kneel before the Pope and receive his blessing, Therese did not stay silent. "Most Holy Father," she said, lifting her tear-filled eyes to his face, "I have a great favor to ask you. In honor of your Jubilee, permit me to enter Carmel at the age of 15. The priest leading the pilgrimage, standing beside the Pope, was visibly displeased. He explained coldly that this was simply a child who wanted to enter early, and that her superiors were already considering the matter. Leo XIII, unbothered, gave the answer everyone in authority had been giving her for months. "Well, my child, do whatever the superiors decide." It was not enough for Therese. She rested her hands on the Pope's knees and made one final attempt. "Oh, Holy Father," she began, and got no further. Two members of the noble guard stepped forward, took her by the arms, and lifted her bodily from the floor. She would not release her grip. They had to pry her hands loose from his knees to carry her out of the audience hall. As she was lifted away, Leo XIII reached out, placed his hand briefly over her lips, and raised it to bless her. Therese would later write that despite the tears, despite the humiliation of being physically removed from a papal audience, she felt something steady beneath the disappointment. A peace she could not fully explain, sitting underneath the surface bitterness of the moment. "Rome," she wrote afterward, "where I thought to find comfort and where I found the cross." She did not get her answer that day. But 6 weeks later, on January 1st, 1888, Bishop Huguenin sent word. Permission granted. She would be allowed to enter, though she would have to wait 3 more months until after her 15th birthday. On April 9th, 1888, Thérèse Martin walked through the doors of the Carmel of Lisieux, The same doors that had swallowed Pauline 6 years earlier, and Marie more recently still. This time, they closed behind her too. She had won. What she had won, she was only beginning to understand. Convent life, for a 15-year-old who had spent 5 years imagining it, did not match the imagining. The Carmel of Lisieux was cold in winter and cold in most other seasons too. The food was plain, sometimes barely edible. The schedule left almost no room for rest. Hours of prayer beginning before dawn, manual labor through the day, silence enforced at nearly every turn. Therese, who had grown up in a warm household full of affection, now lived among women who had taken vows of poverty seriously enough to make even small comforts feel like compromises. She was not, by her own account, a naturally gifted nun. She struggled with needlework. She was clumsy at manual tasks the other sisters performed easily. One nun in particular, Sister Saint Vincent de Paul, known in the community as an excellent embroiderer, made her discomfort with Therese plain and gave her a nickname that stuck: the Big Nanny Goat, a jab at her awkwardness and her tall, gawky adolescent frame. In the convent laundry, another sister worked opposite Therese at the wash basins, splashing dirty water across her face and habit again and again as she scrubbed. Therese's first instinct was to step back and wipe her face, to make clear, without complaint, that she would rather the sister worked more carefully. She caught herself. Instead of pulling away, she stayed where she was and let the water hit her. By her own account, it took about half an hour before she stopped minding it and started, in her words, quite a fancy to what she called this novel kind of aspersion, treasuring the very thing that had annoyed her, simply because it cost her something to treasure it. It was a small, almost invisible discipline. No one but Therese herself would have known it had happened at all, had she not later written it down. This was the beginning of what she would eventually call her little way. Not grand penances or dramatic sacrifices, but a determination to meet every small, ordinary irritation of convent life with a private act of love no one else could see. She was not performing holiness for an audience. There was no audience. That, to her, was the entire point. The convent gave her little room to be anything but ordinary. And then, not long after she arrived, her father began to disappear in a different way. Louis Martin had always been the parent who understood her most, the one who had taken her to Rome, who had knelt beside her at prayer since she was a small girl. In the years after Therese entered Carmel, he began to suffer what his family, in the language of the time, called a painful and humiliating illness of the mind. His condition worsened. Eventually, he had to be admitted to a hospital in Caen, pronounced Khn, where he would spend the last years of his life. Therese, cloistered, could not visit him freely. She could only receive news of him second-hand, through letters passed along by her sisters outside the walls. She would later write that this suffering, watching from a distance as the father she adored lost pieces of himself, drew her closer to a particular image, the face of Christ during his passion, disfigured and unrecognized. She took a new title into her religious name because of it. She would be known from then on not only as Sister Therese of the Child Jesus, but as Sister Therese of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face. Louis Martin died in 1894. By then, Therese's sister Céline, who had stayed behind to care for him as the last daughter still living at home, was finally free to follow her sisters into Carmel. All 4 of the Martin daughters who would become nuns were now inside the same convent walls. What Therese had fought so hard to enter at 15 had slowly become something else. Not an escape into peace, but a small, enclosed world where grief, illness, and quiet devotion were simply the daily furniture of life. She had wanted this. She had clung to a pope's knees for this. And now, inside it, something else was already beginning, quietly, almost without her noticing, that would test everything she thought she understood about the God she had crossed so many doors to reach. By her early 20s, Therese had become something the convent had not expected. A teacher, without ever leaving the building to study, without a single formal theological credential to her name. In 1893, her sister Pauline, by then elected prioress, taking the religious name Mother Agnès of Jesus, appointed Therese assistant to the novice mistress. In practice, this meant that young women entering the convent, uncertain and often struggling exactly as Therese herself once had, were placed under her quiet guidance. She was still only in her 20s. Some of the novices she was training were older than she was. What she taught them was not complicated, and she never pretended it was. She called it her little way, the way of spiritual childhood. Where other saints of the Church had been remembered for visions, ecstasies, or heroic penances, Therese insisted that holiness could be found in something almost embarrassingly small. Doing the ordinary, unnoticed tasks of a day, scrubbing a floor, tolerating an irritating companion, swallowing an unkind word, and offering each one, silently, as an act of love. She put it in her own words, in a prayer she composed on the day of her religious profession, September 8, 1890. I want to sanctify my heartbeats, my thoughts, my simplest actions, uniting them to His infinite merits. It was not a theology built for grand gestures. It was built, deliberately, for people who would never do anything the world would call remarkable. Which was, she believed, almost everyone, herself included. She compared the great saints to lilies and roses, flowers that drew the eye from a distance. She compared herself and the people she hoped to reach to something smaller and easier to overlook. A daisy, a wildflower, a little flower, growing low at the feet of the more impressive blooms. The name would outlive her by more than a century. She wrote once of wanting an elevator to heaven, not the long, difficult staircase of great sacrifice climbed by the saints she had read about as a girl, but something faster and gentler, built for someone too small and too weak to climb such stairs herself. The elevator, she decided, would be the arms of Jesus, lifting her in her smallness, rather than asking her to grow tall enough to reach the top alone. Her novices remembered her patience more than her instruction. She rarely corrected harshly. She did not demand visible progress. She asked instead that they notice the smallest chances each day offered to choose love over irritation. And she asked it of herself first, before she ever asked it of them. In a convent that gave her daily material to practice on. It would have been easy, from the outside, to mistake all of this for simplicity in the lesser sense. A sweetness without substance. A spirituality for children and the untroubled. Those close to her knew otherwise. Her confessor, the Jesuit priest Father Almir Pichon, who had heard her full confession when she first entered Carmel, and had reassured her, to her enormous relief, that she had never committed a mortal sin, once observed that guiding her required no unusual skill on his part. It was easy to direct that child, he said. The Holy Spirit was leading her. But he also noted something else, something that would prove more prophetic than either of them understood at the time. That even in those early years, he could already see the shape of spiritual trials God seemed to be preparing her to pass through. No one, including Therese, yet knew how literally that would come true. For now, in the mid-1890s, her days were ordinary in the way she had always insisted ordinary days could be holy. She swept floors. She corrected novices gently. She composed short devotional plays for her sisters to perform on feast days. She wrote poetry no one outside the convent would read for years. And at her prioress's request, she had begun, almost as an afterthought, in whatever spare time the schedule allowed, writing down her childhood memories in a notebook, an exercise with no larger purpose that either of them could have named. It was called, simply, Manuscript A. Neither Therese nor Mother Agnes had any idea, in 1895, that they were building the foundation of a book that would eventually be read in more than 60 languages, by people living lives Therese would never see. In a century, she would not live to reach 25. The little way asked for nothing dramatic. And yet, within 2 years, Therese's own life was about to demand something far more dramatic than anything her little way had prepared the world to expect from her. The night before Good Friday, 1896, Therese went to bed after a rigorous Lenten fast, feeling, by her own description, a strange and unfamiliar joy. She fell asleep quickly and quietly, the way she nearly always did. She woke to find her mouth full of fluid. She did not need a doctor to tell her what it meant. In an era without antibiotics, a cough of blood in a convent already thin on nourishment and warmth carried one meaning above all others: tuberculosis. She rose, walked to the window, and looked out to confirm what she already suspected. In the fabric of her handkerchief, in the dim light, she saw it clearly. She would later write that her soul filled, strangely, with a kind of consolation. She understood the moment, she said, as Jesus announcing to her, on the anniversary of his own death, that her own end had quietly begun. She told no one, not her sisters, not Mother Agnes, the prioress who had raised her since childhood, and who slept, prayed, and worked mere steps away from her every day. For more than a year, Therese carried the knowledge of her own approaching death in complete silence, continuing her duties as if nothing had changed. It would be more than a year before Mother Agnes learned the truth, not from Therese directly, but from the slow, undeniable evidence of her decline, and finally, reluctantly, from Therese's own admission. The delay, when it came to light, wounded her sister deeply. Why had she said nothing? Why had she let a year pass in silence about something this large? It was, in its own quiet way, one more instance of the little way, carried to an almost unbearable extreme. A sacrifice so private that even the people closest to her had no idea it was being made. What Therese did not say aloud that night, and would not fully commit to paper until much later, was that the illness in her lungs was not the only thing that had entered her that Good Friday Eve. Something else had arrived alongside it in the same hours, and it would prove far harder to name and far harder to bear. She had spent her whole life, since the day the statue of the Virgin Mary had smiled upon her, believing, simply, unshakably, in the reality of heaven. It was the thought that had comforted her through her mother's death, through her father's decline, through every ordinary hardship of convent life. Heaven, for Therese, had never been an abstract doctrine. It had been the plain, solid ground beneath everything else she believed. On the same night the blood came, that ground began, quietly and without warning, to give way. She would not describe what was happening to her in full for nearly another year. Not until a prioress, unaware of what she was truly asking, requested that Therese continue writing down her thoughts as her illness advanced. What emerged from that request would become the most difficult pages Therese ever wrote, and the ones her own family would spend decades afterward trying, in various ways, to soften. For now, in the spring of 1896, only Therese knew two things at once: that her body was dying, and that something inside her she had always trusted completely had begun, in the same moment, to go dark. Fun. Chapter 7. A Wall Against the Sky. By June of 1897, Therese was dying in earnest, and Mother Marie de Gonzague, the prioress at the time, asked her to keep writing. Not childhood memories now, but whatever remained. Reflections, teachings for the sisters she was leaving behind. An account of a life that had barely begun before it was ending. This would become Manuscript C, the last and most difficult of the 3 notebooks that would eventually be bound together as Story of a Soul. It was here, in these final pages, that Therese wrote what her family had not expected and did not know how to receive. She was, she confessed, no longer certain heaven existed at all. "No doubt, dear mother, you will think I exaggerate somewhat the night of my soul," she wrote, addressing Mother Marie de Gonzague directly. And yet it is not a veil. It is a wall which rises to the very heavens and shuts out the starry sky. When she sang, in chapel, of the joy of heaven and the eternal possession of God, the same songs she had once sung with total conviction, she felt nothing. "I sing only of what I wish to believe," she admitted. Occasionally, she wrote, a small ray of light would break through the darkness for an instant. It never comforted her. The memory of that light, once it faded, only made the surrounding blackness feel thicker. This was not a passing crisis of a few difficult weeks. By her own account, and by the account of the sisters who nursed her, it lasted from that first night of blood in April 1896 until her death 17 months later. Never resolving, never lifting, present in her final conscious hours as much as in her first. According to biographer Guy Gaucher, the foremost scholar of Therese's life, she found a way to hold on to her faith, even without feeling it. Her confessor advised her to write out the words of the Apostles' Creed by hand and carry it with her as a physical anchor for a belief she could no longer sense. She is reported to have written it in her own blood, keeping the folded paper against her, a profession of faith she could touch even in the hours she could not feel it was true. This was the young woman the world would come to know, within a few decades, as the Little Flower, a nickname that today conjures rose petals, gentle devotional cards, a saint associated almost entirely with comfort. The nun who actually lived those final 18 months was fighting something considerably harder than a card could hold. There is a further complication to this story, one that the Carmel of Lisieux's own archivists have raised themselves. The version of Story of a Soul that reached the world in 1898, the version that made Therese famous, that Pope Pius X would later read and call the account of the greatest saint of modern times, was not published exactly as she wrote it. Mother Agnes, compiling her sister's 3 notebooks into a single manuscript after Therese's death, edited the text before it went to print. Some Theresian scholars, including researchers working from the Carmel's own archive, have questioned how much of the original harshness, the rawest lines of the dark night, the sharpest edges of Therese's doubt, was softened in that edit, smoothed into something closer to the gentle, consoling voice millions of readers would come to associate with her name. Others maintain the edits were minor, a matter of polish rather than substance, and that the essential darkness of manuscript C survived intact, regardless of which version reached print. The debate remains unsettled among specialists to this day. What is not in dispute is this: the unedited manuscripts, examined directly by scholars in the decades since, confirm that the darkness Therese described was real, was severe, and did not lift before she died. Whatever gentleness later editions added to her voice, they did not invent the wall she wrote about. She built that description herself, in her own hand, while she was still alive to feel it standing in front of her. She kept teaching her novices through it. She kept her small daily disciplines through it. She never stopped, as far as any witness recorded, treating the sisters around her with patience. The single largest spiritual crisis of her life left almost no visible mark on the convent's daily life around her, which meant that for the community she lived among, the little flower they saw every day looked, on the surface, exactly the same as she always had. Only the notebook knew otherwise. By July of 1897, there was no more pretending. Between the 6th of that month and the 5th of August, Therese coughed blood 20 separate times. On July 8th, she was moved permanently into the convent infirmary, the small room where she would spend the rest of her life. Dr. de Cornières, who attended her through these final months, did not hide his reaction from her sisters. "Ah, if you only knew what this young nun was suffering," he told them, a physician's plain astonishment at a level of pain he could do little to relieve. There was no effective treatment for advanced tuberculosis in 1897. What medicine could offer her was mostly the management of symptoms, and even that only partially. On July 30th, she received the sacrament of the sick, then still called extreme unction, the rite administered when death is expected. Far from frightening her, the sacrament filled her with a strange lightness. "The door of my dark prison is ajar," she said afterward. "I am steeped in joy." She had been told by the community's superior that her soul, in that moment, was like a child's after baptism. She believed him. It did not shorten what remained of her suffering by a single day. She would linger for 2 more months. At 2:30 in the afternoon, weeks into a decline that had left her unable even to sit up unaided, she suddenly raised herself in bed. "Dear mother," she said, "the chalice is full to overflowing. I could never have believed that it was possible to suffer so intensely." Small mercies arrived and were received with the same attentiveness she had once given to being splashed with dirty water in the convent laundry. When her mouth grew too dry to bear, her Sister Geneviève, Celine in religious life, pressed a small piece of ice to her lips. Therese accepted it and gave her a smile her sister would later say she never forgot. It looked, Celine wrote, like a final farewell. In her last days, she was offered water to drink. She had a preference, even then, for which kind. "Until 3 o'clock, she said, I prefer Lourdes water. It's more devotional." It was one of the last small choices left to her, and she made it with the same quiet attention she brought to everything else. Outside her window, through those final days, robins and small birds sang, loudly, persistently, for hours. One of the sisters at her bedside found the sound unbearable to witness. She prayed silently for the birds to fall quiet, afraid the noise was draining what little strength Therese had left. The birds, did not stop. Late one night, an infirmarian entering the room found Therese lying with her hands raised toward the ceiling, unmoving, unspeaking, her eyes fixed somewhere the sister could not see. She had spent 9 years inside these walls, having entered them at 15 with such force that a pope's own guards had to carry her out of a room to make her let go. She would leave them now the only way anyone leaves a cloistered convent for good. By mid-September, Therese could no longer move without pain. On the 12th, her feet began to swell, a sign to those nursing her that the end was close. By the 14th, the community understood she would not survive another 2 weeks. She grew too weak to speak for long stretches. She struggled, increasingly, simply to breathe. Even now, the darkness she had lived with for 18 months had not lifted. On September 22nd, she could not speak at all. In the days that followed, she had no strength left to turn herself in bed. Attacks of suffocation came and went. By the 29th, she had entered what her sisters, in the plain language of the convent, called her agony. Looking out at the branches beyond her window during one of these final days, Therese noticed a single dead leaf still clinging to its stem, held only by a thin strand of spider's silk, swinging back and forth in the wind. She had been watching it for some time. "See," she said, "it's a picture of myself. My life hangs only on a light thread." On the morning of September 30th, she fixed her eyes on the statue of the Virgin Mary near her bed and spoke of the night just past. "Oh, with what fervor I have prayed to her," she said. "And yet it has been pure agony, without a ray of consolation. Earth's air is failing me. When shall I breathe the air of heaven?" Even now, even here, hours from death, the wall she had written about in manuscript C had not come down. She was asking, still, when she would finally know for certain what she had spent her whole religious life believing. The community gathered around her bed that evening as the church bell rang for the Angelus. She looked for a long while at the statue of the Virgin. At a few minutes past 7, the prioress dismissed the rest of the sisters from the room. Alone with her closest attendants, Therese managed to speak once more. "Mother," she said, "isn't this the agony? Am I not going to die?" "Yes, my poor little one," came the answer. "It's the agony. But God perhaps wills to prolong it for several hours." "Well, all right," Therese said. "All right. I would not want to suffer for a shorter time." She looked at the crucifix she held in her hands. "Oh, I love him. My God, I love you." Her head fell back. The prioress had the bell rung again, calling the community back into the room. The sisters who knelt around her bed in those final moments would later agree on what they saw. Her face, tense with pain only moments before, went suddenly peaceful. Her eyes lifted, fixed for a moment just above the statue of the Virgin, the same statue whose smile had healed her when she was 10 years old. Then she sank back against the pillow, eyes closed, and smiled. She looked, one of the sisters wrote afterward, very young and very beautiful. It was about 20 minutes past 7 in the evening. She was 24 years old. Outside, by nightfall, the dead leaf that had swung from its single thread of spider silk for days finally let go of the branch and fell to the ground. One of the sisters picked it up, still trailing its thread, and kept it. Thérèse Martin was buried 4 days later, on October 4th, 1897, in the ordinary municipal cemetery at Lisieux, in a plot beside the parents she had loved so completely. Louis, whose mind had failed him, and Zélie, whom she barely remembered. There was no reason at that moment to expect the world outside those cemetery walls would ever learn her name. What changed everything was a small book almost no one had asked for. Story of a Soul, compiled from the 3 notebooks she had filled at her sister's request, edited by Mother Agnès, and printed in a modest first run intended mainly for other Carmelite convents, began, within a few years, to travel far beyond anything the sisters at Lisieux could have arranged themselves. It crossed into parishes, then dioceses, then countries. Letters started arriving at the convent from strangers who had never set foot in France, describing favors they credited to a nun none of them had met. Roses arrived too, or reports of them did. Exactly as Therese had promised before she died, people around the world began describing roses appearing at moments of answered prayer. On a hospital pillow, on a doorstep, in a bouquet that had not been there the day before. The church itself, moving carefully, opened a formal investigation into the growing devotion. Within 4 years, testimony was being gathered from witnesses who had known her. Within 17, Pope Pius X, after reading her notebooks himself, was calling her, privately, the greatest saint of modern times, and pressing to have her cause examined without the usual decades of delay. 2 illnesses doctors had already declared beyond hope were investigated and recognized by the Vatican's own medical commission as unexplained by medicine. A religious sister's fatal stomach hemorrhage, a young seminarian's advanced tuberculosis. Both healed, both credited to Therese's intercession, both required for her beatification in 1923. 2 more followed for her canonization 2 years later, a nun's infected knee and a Belgian woman's intestinal tuberculosis, healed instantly at Therese's own tomb, in front of a doctor who had no explanation to offer. On May 17, 1925, in St. Peter's Basilica, before 23 cardinals, 250 bishops, and 50,000 of the faithful, Pope Pius XI declared the cloistered nun from Lisieux a saint. 28 years had passed since her death, a fraction of the time such causes normally required. It did not stop there. In 1997, on the 100th anniversary of her death, Pope John Paul II named her a Doctor of the Universal Church. Only the 3rd woman in 2,000 years of church history to receive that title. And, at 24 years old, the youngest person of either sex ever to hold it. In 2015, her parents, Louis and Zélie, were canonized together. The first married couple in history to be made saints as a pair. Their cause carried forward in part by a premature infant in Spain whose recovery from a brain hemorrhage doctors could not otherwise account for. None of it required her to have been certain, in her final hours, that any of it was real. The dead leaf that fell from its thread of spider's silk the night she died was picked up by one of her sisters and kept. A small, ordinary object, exactly the kind of thing Therese had spent her whole religious life insisting mattered. Today, the basilica built in her name at Lisieux is the 2nd most visited pilgrimage site in France, after Lourdes. Her relics have traveled to every continent on earth. In the year of the centenary of her canonization, her reliquary crossed the Atlantic once more, drawing crowds who had grown up on a saint they knew mainly through rose petals and gentle prayer cards. Most of them with no idea that the woman inside those relics had spent the final year and a half of her life unsure there was a heaven to reach at all. She is still, by some estimates, one of the most petitioned saints in the Catholic world, invoked most often by people facing exactly what she faced: a serious illness, a fading faith, a fear that the God they have trusted their whole lives might not, in the end, be there. If a woman canonized for her confidence in God's love could spend her last 18 months unable to feel that confidence at all, and choose anyway to keep loving in the dark, what does that mean for anyone else standing in a darkness of their own tonight? If this story moved you, consider subscribing to Halos and Histories. New documentaries on the lives of the saints, released regularly. This is Halos and Histories, stories the saints left behind.